place here is full of history.
Little Rock's 9th Street, also known as the end of the line and Little Harlem.
It's just, wow.
Through the eyes of someone who lived, ate, walked, and breathed here, Emmett White remembers it all.
Black tailors, you know, everybody down here were black. It was a black business, you know.
The early 1900s, probably to about the 1960s, 70s, I guess you would say, are the peak times.
Tamika Lee and Chris Hancock work at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, one of the last two bookends of the historic street remaining.
People of all, races, creeds, religious backgrounds flocked to this area because the restaurants were great, the clubs were great. It was a cultural center for really the entire city.
As you walk along 9th Street, you can see most of these buildings are no longer in use, but these blocks are still filled with dozens of memories. Carrie McCoy takes us inside Taborian Hall and on a tour of the other bookend.
Here is the Dreamland Ballroom.
Decades ago, these seats were filled with people who came miles away to hear some of the greatest performers in American musical history. Performers like the Queen of Jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, and Louis Satchmo Armstrong. Now, paint chips away, but the spotlights still shine on the stage where the greats once performed.
It just kind of, keeps that sense of pride going to know this is what 9th Street was, this is what Little Rock had to offer, and maybe what we can have to offer again.
The museum also keeps those memories alive.
It's actually our exhibit that focuses on a city within a city.
Telling the stories of the historic Little Harlem district.
Because that story is one that needs to keep being told.
In hopes that one day, the sounds that once resonated in the ballroom and pictures that hang in this museum will come alive again on 9th Street.
Often when people think about 9th Street, they immediately think of the business district.
But Little Rock's West 9th Street was so much more.
People often called it a mini Harlem, so it was a mini metropolis. If you were here at that time, 9th Street is definitely where you wanted to be.
A hub for Black culture and Black success. Keith Fletcher with Mosaic Templars Cultural Center says the wealth that existed on 9th Street was overwhelming.
Millions of dollars of wealth that existed right here on 9th Street. And so I think that's something that a lot of people don't know and don't realize.
So with all this success, what happened to this thriving hotspot? Well, a cluster of things had an impact. Creation of big box stores, desegregation, and the placement of I-630.
The development of 630 was not change that the African American community wanted, nor was it a change that the African American community needed.
Definitely a loss for the Black culture and, and for the city as a whole, because it was such a vibrant community.
That vibrant community created history since the end of the Civil War. History that is now only told through memories.
Oh yeah, we remember the Diplomat, but honey, we called it the Dip.
And pictures. Dozens recently found by Brian Robertson with the Central Arkansas Library System. They were right under his nose this whole time.
Just happened to pull the box out one day and started looking through it, and I was like, wow, these are amazing.
Robertson says he knew this new look at history needed to be shared.
At that point, I decided to digitize them and then came up with the idea to put the exhibit together.
The exhibit uses Google Earth to look through the photos that show what was once 9th Street. You'll see kids playing, all of the homes, the businesses. You're able to see the spirit of this cultural epicenter. Another exhibit lives at Mosaic Templars. You can walk through this one. Fletcher says her hopes from either of them are that people learn about the lost jewel, and maybe developers work to bring something like Lost West 9th Street back to the capital city.
It is historic because the history lives, and we hope that one day maybe that history can be revived.
Whether you're driving to and from work, going to Chenal for a day of shopping or a night out with friends, you likely use I-630. But let's go back in time to look at its history and impact. The development of the East-West Expressway spanned over 2 decades.
And they start talking about it in the 1940s. The early 1950s, you see concrete plans.
One of the reasons behind the development of the interstate,
people could live in the suburbs of Little Rock and still work downtown with an ease to and from work.
At the time, President Dwight D. Eisenhower called the development of the interstate highway system, quote, essential to the national interest. With the passing of the Federal Highway Act, this was the largest public works program in American history at the time. But it came at a cost to the African American community.
9th, 10th, and 11th Street in the black community was pretty much wiped out.
Brian Rogers is a local historian who works with Mosaic Templars. He says back then, West 9th Street was compared to the bustling streets of Harlem.
At one point, there were over 100 black businesses along 9th Street. In an interview that I saw, people said we could come and shop with dignity. There was nobody following us around the store, constantly asking, did we need anything?
But today, a lot of those black businesses no longer exist.
The only original building is Arkansas Flag and Banner, which was Taborian Hall.
Black families were impacted too, forced to move out so the interstate could move in.
During that time, during the early 50s, mid-50s, there was no political representation for the black community.
For African Americans who didn't want to give up their business or homes, there really wasn't an option for them.
There's a government tool that they use called eminent domain, and they declared that that land was best served for the public interest, and they took it and they compensated you anyway, but they forced you to leave.
The Federal Highway Act not only had huge impacts here in Arkansas, but across the entire country. Estimates from the U.S. Department of Transportation reveal the interstate program displaced almost 500,000 households and more than 1 million people. Some scholars, like NYU Law's Deborah Archer, claim most were black and poor.
Some of them were never able to buy new homes, and they just ended up renting homes for the rest of their lives.
Some scholars conclude these impacts have spanned generations and can still be felt in the African American community.
Certainly, it reduced the wealth of the African American community in Little Rock.
Rogers also tells us through research he's conducted, the interstate not only inadvertently separated people by race and class, but also separated resources.
The Heights is a relatively small area, but has 2 fire stations. South of 630, the majority of the businesses that you find are churches and liquor stores.
Flash forward to today, community groups and politicians in major cities like Dallas, Nashville, and Minneapolis are pushing to rethink and redesign interstates to hopefully bring communities back together. Some of those ideas include covering current interstates with green space and parks.
I don't know what the future holds for Little Rock in terms of I-630, I-30, but I think there are some things to think about and some progress that could be made.